Most organizations treat Microsoft 365 as a collection of features to be purchased. They are wrong. What they're actually operating is an economic system, and like all systems, it leaks, not dramatically, silently. Let me walk you through the 7 patterns I see over and over. Each one individually looks manageable. Together, they compound into what I call architectural entropy, the slow, invisible decay of value in your Microsoft tenant. Sin 1, the myth of procurement as strategy. The lie sounds simple. Buy the right license, get the right outcome. Most organizations believe that purchasing E5 licenses equals digital transformation. They tell their CFO they're modernizing. They renew annually. Nobody questions whether the capability they bought is actually creating value. Here's what happens instead. A global engineering firm with 5,000 seats decides to go digital. They land on E5 as the standard, 90% adoption across the knowledge worker base. On paper, perfect. In reality, only a fraction of users ever touched the premium connectors. Copilot sat unused. Defender features were never operationalized. After 18 months, a rationalization audit revealed the truth. 56% of those licenses were either inactive, underutilized, or completely misaligned with actual work patterns, by role, by region, by function. The economic leakage? $1.6 million annually. They were financing architectural erosion without knowing it. This is what I mean by procurement masquerading as strategy. You bought a feature bundle. You mistook it for an operating model. The control plane fix is brutally simple. If you cannot map telemetry to quarterly value realization, if you cannot prove that the premium capabilities you paid for are actively driving business outcomes, then you don't have architecture. You have procurement, and procurement by definition has no accountability for the money after the check clears. Sin 2, permission sprawl. The authorization compiler nobody built. The next pattern is permission creep, and it's more dangerous than most organizations realize. In Entra ID, there's a default culture I call add-only. Permissions get granted, they rarely get revoked. That's not incompetence, that's design inertia. No one owns the lifecycle. No one reviews it, so it accumulates. I audited a financial services firm last year. They discovered 847 orphaned app registrations, applications that were granted permissions 3 years ago for a pilot project that was abandoned. The permissions were never removed. The service principals still held Microsoft Graph rights to access tenant data, user information, mailbox contents. 54% of IT leaders report complex identity and privilege sprawl. In large tenants, it's normal to have 200, 300, sometimes 400 privileged applications running with permissions that nobody can fully account for. Here's the economic consequence: audit friction, breach exposure, operational paralysis. When a compliance team asks who has access to what, the answer takes weeks to assemble. And in a breach, you're blind. You don't know what was exposed because you don't know what permissions existed. The control plane fix is this: treat permissions as entropy generators, not rewards. Design expiration into every access grant from the start. Enforce lifecycle ownership. If an application's purpose has expired, its permissions expire with it, automatically. This is not optional. This is architectural law. Sin 3, tactical governance, the theater of compliance. Most organizations claim they have governance. What they actually have is theater. I walked into a healthcare organization with 72 teams' governance policies, all of them documented, none of them automated. They relied on manual approvals, on reactive policing, on human bottlenecks, on inconsistent enforcement. How many manual hours went into that every year? 4,000, minimum. Someone's job was refreshing spreadsheets and sending escalation emails. 72% of organizations cannot enforce full governance policies at scale. And the reason is always the same. They built governance as a control function instead of a systems layer. The economic consequence is hidden but substantial. 4,000 hours annually per organization. That's 2 full-time employees just maintaining compliance theater. And it's fragile. One person leaves, the policies drift, the system decays. The fix is existential. Governance that isn't code is just a suggestion. If you're still relying on PDF policies and SharePoint checklists and email approvals, you have compliance theater, not compliance. Automate it. Make it part of the system. Make violations impossible, not just monitor it. If you cannot automate it, you don't actually have governance. You have hope. Sin 4, app worship, confusing output with architecture. Enterprises celebrate app proliferation. We shipped 50 Power Apps this year. Citizen developers are empowered. Feature velocity is accelerating. But here's what actually happened. You created 50 new maintenance liabilities, 50 new surface area multipliers. Every app is another piece of code someone has to support, another integration that can fail, another attack surface to defend. A mid-market organization had 340 Power Apps in their tenant. 127 of them had never been used. Nobody owned them. Nobody maintained them. They were digital cruft. The systemic cause is structural. Builders get rewarded for creation. Architects are invisible, so the tenant fills up with applications that looked good in isolation but created technical debt at scale. The economic consequence is support overhead, compliance risk, vendor sprawl. When you have 340 applications, the complexity of governance becomes overwhelming. Entitlements multiply, integrations tangle, security becomes impossible to manage. The control plane fix is architectural zoning. Stop counting apps. Start counting technical debt surface area. Enforce lifecycle ownership. Decommission anything that doesn't have a clear owner and a business justification. Treat app portfolios the way you'd treat real estate. Not every building belongs in your district. Sin 5. AI chaos. Agents without boundaries. This one is still forming. Most organizations don't see it yet. That's the danger. Organizations are deploying Copilot onto flat, unclassified data structures. They're standing up Copilot Studio agents without defining what data those agents can access. They're accelerating AI adoption while data governance lags behind. Here's what I mean. An enterprise Copilot pilot, 6 weeks in, discovered that custom agents were accessing personally identifiable information without classification. They were reading payroll data, benefit information, address records, all available because the data was unclassified and the agent permissions were unrestricted. The economic consequence is immediate and expensive. Security retrofits, Copilot Studio credits burning through the budget, regulatory exposure, compliance re-audits, all because someone deployed AI without architectural zoning. 49% of AI programs stall due to unclear value. 80% of Fortune 500 use agents without formal governance. The pattern is familiar: speed first, architecture second, then disaster. The fix is non-negotiable. Define data boundaries before deploying agents. Classify data. Tier agents by risk. Enforce data access via identity and policy. Treat AI not as a feature to ship, but as a governance layer that has to sit on top of solid data architecture. If your data foundation is weak, AI amplifies the weakness. It doesn't fix it. Sin 6. Builder bias, the architect vacuum. Here's a pattern that explains everything else. Enterprises promote the person who knows the buttons. They reward builders. They celebrate features shipped. And architects, the people thinking about system resilience, about decay, about integration costs, those people are invisible. An IT director recently hired a Power Platform expert and fired the identity architect. The reasoning was straightforward. We need builders right now. Strategy can wait. What actually happened was structural. Without architects enforcing design constraints, the platform started accumulating entropy faster. Features shipped, systems decayed, technical debt compounded. The economic consequence is an 18-month productivity wall. Initial gains from rapid development flatten, then performance degrades, then you're managing technical debt instead of shipping features. The systemic problem is organizational. Only 23% of organizations have formal AI agent identity strategy. Ownership is fragmented. CISOs see security risks. Builders see opportunity. Finance sees cost. Nobody's looking at the system as a whole. The control plane fix requires a mindset shift. Treat architects as leverage engineers, not cost centers. Measure them by system health, by entropy reduction, by the number of future problems they prevent. Builders create visible value. Architects create invisible value. Invisible value is just as real. It's just harder to see. Sin 7. Licensing blindness, capacity as strategy. The final sin is the most expensive because it's the most normalized. Organizations renew E5 because it's what we do. Not because they've mapped capability to value, not because they've assessed whether users actually need premium features, not because they've measured adoption of the capabilities they're already paying for. Meanwhile, shadow IT thrives. Users on basic SKUs accomplish the same roles. Premium features sit idle. The licensing strategy becomes a budget line item, not an architectural lever. Real numbers: an enterprise paying $2.1 million annually for E5 across the board. A rationalization audit found that 34% of those users could perform their exact same role on business standard. They had no need for the premium connector library. They didn't use Copilot. They didn't need advanced threat protection beyond what business standard includes. The economic consequence is orthogonal to what most organizations see. It's not just the cost of unused licenses. It's the cost of not using licensing as a behavioral incentive. If your licensing SKU is aligned to roles and capabilities, then it drives adoption. It forces you to make decisions about what's actually needed. The control plane fix is this: licensing SKU is a behavioral lever. Use it. If you're paying for E5 across the board, you've removed the constraint that forces architectural discipline. You've said effectively that everyone gets access to everything. That's not strategy. That's capitulation. These 7 sins are patterns, not anomalies. They compound. Permission sprawl feeds app sprawl. Licensing blindness enables governance theater. Procurement strategy masks the absence of architecture. Together they create what I call the leakage model. Millions of dollars in invisible inefficiency that nobody's measuring because nobody owns the outcome. That's the diagnosis. That's what we're actually operating here. The umbrella sin control plane neglect. These 7 sins don't exist in isolation. They're not random failures. They're all symptoms of one structural absence. And that absence is what I want to talk about now. Operating without a systems layer means Entropy becomes your default operating system. You don't have governance, you have chaos with policies written on top of it. You don't have architecture, you have a platform, which is something else entirely. Here's how it manifests. A 10,000-seat organization I worked with had Entra ID governed by one team, Intune handled by another, Microsoft Defender managed separately, Purview, data governance owned by compliance. Teams in SharePoint loosely monitored by service adoption. Nobody was looking at identity to app orchestration. Nobody was enforcing zoning and tiering across the entire system. Every service had its own policies, its own approval workflows, its own definitions of security baseline. What that organization actually had wasn't a security posture. It was security theater, orchestrated across 5 different teams. The systemic cause is this. Most organizations treat Microsoft Cloud as a collection of disconnected services. Identity over here, data governance over there, applications somewhere else. Compliance in a separate silo. This creates what I call policy fragmentation. Each domain solves its own problems locally, but there's no layer that decides how those domains interact, how data flows from one system to another, how a user's access in Entra ID connects to what they can do in SharePoint, what they can see in a Copilot agent. That connecting layer, that's the control plane. And most organizations don't have one. The economic consequence of operating without it is staggering. That 10,000-seat organization, 3.2 million in unrealized productivity benefits over 3 years. Not because they lacked features, they had every Microsoft feature available. But because those features weren't integrated into a system, users couldn't find information, admins couldn't trust their governance, architects had no way to enforce decisions at scale. Control plane absence also means security debt accumulates. When Entra ID policies drift, you don't know it. When SharePoint permissions exceed your threshold, there's nobody watching. When a Copilot agent is accessing data you never approved, the policy layer doesn't catch it. Each service does its best. But there's no circuit breaker, no orchestration, no central place where someone says, no, that violates our architecture. The control plane fix requires a foundational shift. You have to build a unified policy compilation layer. Treat identity, Entra ID as the control plane backbone. Make it the place where you define not just who can access what, but what that access means across your entire system. A user is an employee, a contractor, a vendor, a guest. Once you make that decision in identity, every other system, Defender, Purview, Teams, SharePoint, should inherit that context, not ask for it separately. Inherit it, then enforce cross-platform orchestration. If a user's Entra ID role says they're in finance, that determines their default access to financial data in SharePoint. If they're classified as guest, that determines what they see in Teams. If a Copilot agent is tagged as accessing customer data, its identity and permissions flow from a single source of truth. Let me define this precisely. A control plane is the system that makes decisions about how other systems behave. It's the layer above execution. It's where intent is translated into policy. Without it, you have a platform, individual services, operating independently. With it, you have architecture. You have a system. Most organizations have the first. Almost none have the second. And that distinction is the difference between leaking millions invisibly and knowing exactly where your money is going. That distinction is the difference between a security posture and security theater. That distinction is the difference between governance that works and governance that's just a suggestion people ignore when it inconveniences them. This is what makes the 7 sins actually dangerous. It's not that they exist independently, it's that they compound because there's no central control layer catching them, measuring them, stopping them from spiraling. Without control plane architecture, you're not managing a system, you're managing a collection of problems. Sin 2, permission sprawl, the authorization compiler nobody built. The next pattern I see constantly is permission creep, and it's more dangerous than most organizations realize because it operates silently, compounding over years while nobody's watching. In Entra ID, there's a default culture I call add only. When permissions get granted, they rarely get revoked. That's not incompetence, that's architectural inertia. No lifecycle ownership, no systematic review, no expiration mechanism built into the system, so it accumulates. Here's how it works. A developer needs access to a specific Microsoft Graph endpoint. An application gets registered, it receives permissions, the project succeeds, the developer moves on, and the application registration sits there, still holding permissions because nobody owned the task of sunsetting it. I audited a financial services firm last year. They discovered 847 orphaned app registrations. Applications that were granted permissions 3, 4, sometimes 5 years ago for pilots that were abandoned. The permissions were never removed. The service principal still held Microsoft Graph rights to access tenant data, user information, mailbox contents. Some of them had credentials that hadn't been rotated in years. 54% of IT leaders report complex identity and privilege sprawl in their environments. In a large tenant, it's normal to have 200, 300, sometimes 400 privileged applications running simultaneously with permissions that nobody can fully account for. Add in the growth of automation, AI agents, and custom integrations, and that number explodes. 125 or more apps holding elevated rights is no longer anomalous, it's expected. And here's what makes it dangerous. Each of these applications is a potential entry point, not just for attackers, for compliance violations, for uncontrolled data access, for mission creep, where an application that was designed to do one thing gradually gets permissions to do 5 other things because convenience wins over governance. The economic consequence manifests in multiple ways. First, audit friction. When a compliance team asks who has access to what in your tenant, the answer takes weeks to assemble. You're querying app registrations, you're tracking credential history, you're cross-referencing permissions against actual usage, and half the time you find permissions that shouldn't exist, and then you have to decide whether removing them will break something nobody remembers depending on. Second, breach exposure. In a breach scenario, you don't know what was exposed because you don't know what permissions actually existed. You assume an attacker who compromised the service principal can access customer data, financial records, employee information. But do they have graph permissions? Do they have mail delegation? Can they reset passwords? You're guessing, and guessing in a breach is expensive. Third, operational paralysis. You can't move forward with security hardening because you don't understand the dependency graph. You can't enforce conditional access because it might break an integration nobody documented. You can't implement least privilege because the permission landscape is too sprawling to untangle. The systemic cause is architectural. Most organizations lack entitlement management discipline. There's no designed life cycle for applications, no automatic expiration, no regular access reviews that have teeth, no mechanism that says if you don't explicitly renew this permission every 6 months, it gets revoked. The control plane fix is this. Treat permissions as entropy generators, not rewards. Every time you grant access, you're adding entropy to the system. Design expiration into every access grant from the start. Make it automatic. If an application's purpose has been fulfilled or abandoned, its permissions expire with it. Don't require a manual cleanup process that depends on someone remembering. Make it architectural law. This means implementing entitlement management that's not just an audit tool, but a governance engine. Lifecycle workflows that automatically remove permissions based on defined criteria, access packages that expire, service principles with credential rotation enforced, regular access reviews that don't just report on sprawl, they remediate it. And critically, it means assigning lifecycle ownership. Someone has to be accountable for whether an application still serves a business purpose. And if the answer is no, the permissions go. Not eventually, immediately. Permission sprawl is the invisible attack surface. But the real problem is deeper. It's governance that isn't automated. Sin 3. Tactical governance, the theater of compliance. Most organizations claim they have governance. What they actually have is theater. I walked into a healthcare organization last year with 72 teams' governance policies, all of them documented, beautifully written, signed off by compliance leadership, none of them automated, 0. What did they rely on instead? Manual approvals. Someone had to review new teams' requests and decide whether they met policy criteria. Reactive policing. When someone created a Teams channel without classification, someone else had to send them an email asking them to fix it. Human bottlenecks everywhere. And inconsistent enforcement. Some teams got corrected, others didn't. It depended on who noticed and how busy they were. The real measure of governance isn't policy documents, it's enforcement. And this organization had no enforcement mechanism. They had hope. Here's how it manifests in practice. A business unit wants to create a new team's workspace. They fill out a form. It goes into an approval queue. Someone reviews it against 72 governance policies, manually comparing what they're proposing against written criteria. This takes time. If the request doesn't clearly violate a policy, it gets approved. If it's ambiguous, it gets escalated. If the escalation path is blocked, it gets approved by default because nobody wants to be the person blocking business velocity. Then someone creates the team, and then someone else has to verify that it was set up correctly. Check the sensitivity label, verify the membership controls, confirm the sharing settings, all manual, all dependent on discipline and memory. How many manual hours did that organization spend every year maintaining compliance theater? 4,000. Minimum. That's 2 full-time employees whose entire job was spreadsheets and escalation emails and follow-up conversations about policy drift. And it was fragile. When the person maintaining the governance process left the organization, knowledge walked out the door. Policies drifted. New teams started getting created without the controls that were supposed to exist. The system decayed. This is the fundamental disconnect. 72% of organizations cannot enforce full governance policies at scale. And the reason is always the same. They built governance as a control function, something you do after the fact, react to violations, remind people to comply. Instead of building it as a systems layer, the systemic cause is structural. Governance is treated as a necessary evil. Compliance is seen as friction. So organizations minimize the investment. They write policies, they create processes, they hope people follow them, and then they're shocked when the system breaks under the weight of actual organizational scale. The economic consequence is hidden but substantial. 4,000 hours annually per organization. That's 2 full-time people just maintaining governance theater. And it's fragile. One person leaves. Priorities shift. The governance system decays because it was never actually part of the architecture. It was bolted on top, dependent on sustained discipline and attention that eventually withers. The control plane fix is existential. Governance that isn't code is just a suggestion. If you're still relying on PDF policies and SharePoint checklists and email approvals, you have compliance theater. You don't have governance. And here's why it matters. Theater scales poorly. It breaks when you need it most. It depends on heroic individual effort, and it never actually prevents violations. It just documents them after they happen. Real governance works differently. When someone creates a team's workspace, the system automatically applies the correct sensitivity label. The access controls are set, the membership restrictions are enforced. The data classification is inherited from the policy layer. No approval queue, no human review, no gap between intent and execution. That requires automation, it requires code, it requires treating governance as part of the system architecture, not as an external control function. If you cannot automate your governance, you don't actually have governance, you have hope, and hope is not a control. Sin 4, app worship, confusing output with architecture. Enterprises celebrate app proliferation. We shipped 50 power apps this year. Citizen developers are empowered. Feature velocity is accelerating. The business is moving faster. We're transforming. But here's what actually happened. You created 50 new maintenance liabilities, 50 new surface area multipliers. Every application is another piece of code someone has to support, another integration that can fail, another attack surface to defend, another permission boundary to govern. This is where the builder bias I mentioned earlier collides with architectural reality. Builders get rewarded for shipping. The organization sees features. The business celebrates velocity. And nobody's counting the cost in technical debt. A mid-market organization I worked with had 340 power apps in their tenant. 340. I asked them how many were actively used. They didn't know. So we audited it. 127 of them had never been used. Not once. Nobody ever registered a successful run. Some of them had been created 3 years ago. The original builder had long since moved on or left the organization. Nobody owned them. Nobody maintained them. They were digital cruft, sitting in the environment, creating governance complexity and compliance risk. Of the remaining 213 apps that were actually used, fewer than half had documented business owners. The ones that did, the owners often didn't realize they owned them. They'd inherited the responsibility when they took over a team, or the original creator had left it assigned to them without ever asking. The systemic cause is structural. Builders get promotions for shipping features. Architects are invisible, so the tenant fills up with applications that looked good in isolation but created technical debt at scale. There was no gating function, no architectural review that asked, is this app necessary? Does it duplicate existing capability? Who owns it? What happens when the builder leaves? Instead, the organization operated on optimistic assumptions. Power apps are low-code. Citizens can build them. That's empowerment. That's agility. And it is, until you wake up one day with 340 applications and no idea what most of them do. The economic consequence is operational paralysis. Support overhead explodes. When an application breaks, who fixes it? If the original builder is gone, nobody knows the code. So you either let it stay broken, or you spend engineering time reverse engineering something that was never properly documented. Compliance risk multiplies. When an auditor asks how many applications access customer data, you can't answer confidently. Vendor sprawl increases. Every app might integrate with external SaaS systems. Every integration is another contract, another permission boundary, another security surface. And here's the thing nobody talks about. Application sprawl mirrors the sprawl you see in Teams and SharePoint. It's the same root cause. Default permissive settings. No lifecycle governance, no expiration mechanism, no architecture that says, if this application has no owner, it gets decommissioned. The control plane fix requires a mindset shift. Stop counting apps. That's the wrong metric. Start counting technical debt surface area. The real question isn't how many power apps do we have. It's what is the total complexity and maintenance burden we've accumulated, and is it justified by business value? Enforce zoning laws. Not every application belongs in the environment. Some should be built as power platform solutions, governed as infrastructure. Others should be SaaS products, not custom builds. Some should be enterprise applications with formal governance. Some should be ephemeral tools that disappear after they solve the problem they were meant to solve. And assign lifecycle ownership. Make it architectural law. An application without an identified accountable owner gets decommissioned. Not eventually, immediately. That forces discipline. It forces the organization to ask, do we actually need this? Instead of accumulating forever. This brings us to the most dangerous sin. Because it's one thing to have 340 applications creating support overhead. It's another entirely when you deploy AI onto that chaotic, sprawling application landscape without architectural zoning. Sin 5. AI chaos. Agents without boundaries. This one is still forming. Most organizations don't see it yet. That's the danger. Organizations are deploying Copilot onto flat, unclassified data structures. They're standing up Copilot Studio agents without defining what data those agents can access. They're accelerating AI adoption while data governance lags behind. And here's the architectural truth. AI doesn't solve your data problem. It broadcasts it at scale. Let me tell you what I mean. An enterprise Copilot pilot 6 weeks in, they were excited. Initial adoption metrics looked strong. Users were asking the agent questions about products, customers, internal processes. And then someone asked it a question about compensation. The agent answered. It told them salary data, benefits information, payroll details from the HR system, all available because the data was unclassified and the agent permissions were unrestricted. Here's what actually happened architecturally. The organization deployed Copilot before they classified their data, before they defined what Copilot agents could access, before they implemented data boundaries. They treated AI as a feature to ship, not as a governance layer that has to sit on top of solid data architecture. The systemic cause is predictable. AI feels urgent. Everyone's talking about it. Competitors are moving, so organizations rush. They want to show value quickly. Copilot adoption metrics, agent deployment numbers, proof of concept turned pilot turned production, all before the foundational architecture is in place. But here's what happens when you deploy AI without data architecture. An agent gets access to everything it needs to do its job. That's reasonable, but everything it needs expands. It integrates with SharePoint. Now it's reading all documents. It connects to the mailbox system. Now it's processing email. It links to customer data. Now it's handling sensitive information. Each integration makes sense in isolation. Collectively, they create an unrestricted data access pattern that violates your compliance requirements and your common sense. The economic consequence is immediate and expensive. Security retrofits. You deployed Copilot. Now you're scrambling to classify data retroactively, define boundaries, restrict agent access. That's rework. That's budget you didn't plan for. Copilot Studio credits burning through. Every agent interaction consumes credits. At $200 per 25,000 messages at scale, this becomes a line item nobody forecasted. Regulatory exposure. You're processing payroll data, customer information, health records through an AI system that wasn't designed with compliance in mind. Auditors notice, regulators notice, and then you're explaining why you deployed AI faster than you implemented governance. Real numbers. 49% of AI programs stall due to unclear value. 80% of Fortune 500 use agents without formal governance. The pattern is universal. Speed first, architecture second, then disaster. The control plane fix is non-negotiable. Define data boundaries before deploying agents. Not after, before. This means classifying your data, tiering agents by risk. An agent that answers FAQ questions has different access requirements than an agent that processes financial transactions. An agent that reads public documents has different boundaries than an agent that accesses customer records. Then enforce data access via identity and policy. Use Agent 365 as a governance layer. When you deploy an agent, its permissions flow from Entra ID. It has a defined identity. It can access only the data it's authorized to access. Its interactions are audited. It can be revoked if it's misused. This requires architectural discipline. It requires saying no to speed. It requires doing the unglamorous work of data classification and boundary definition before you ship the next agent. But without it, AI doesn't solve your data problems. It creates new ones. It takes the sprawl and the governance gaps you already have and amplifies them at scale. It turns hidden risks into active liabilities. And here's the uncomfortable truth. If your organization has 340 power apps without owners, if you have 700 orphaned app registrations in Entra ID, if you have governance policies that nobody enforces, then you're not ready to deploy AI agents. Because AI will make all of that worse. It will inherit all of that chaos, and it will operate at a speed that your manual governance processes can't keep up with. This brings us to the root cause. All these sins don't exist independently. They exist because of one, structural absence. Sin 6, builder bias, the architect vacuum. Here's a pattern that explains everything else. And it's organizational, not technical. Enterprises promote the person who knows the buttons, the person who shipped the feature, the person who delivered on deadline. They reward builders, they celebrate features shipped, they measure velocity. And architects, the people thinking about system resilience, about decay, about integration costs, about what happens 5 years from now, those people are invisible. An IT director I worked with recently made a telling decision. They hired a Power Platform expert, and they fired the identity architect. The reasoning was straightforward. We need builders right now. We need people who can ship. Strategy can wait. Modernization can wait. We need features and we need them fast. What actually happened was structural. Without architects enforcing design constraints, without someone saying, no, we can't do it that way, the platform started accumulating entropy faster. Features shipped, systems decayed, technical debt compounded. 18 months later, the organization hit what I call the productivity wall. Initial gains from rapid development flattened, performance degraded, infrastructure complexity made change harder, and the organization was managing technical debt instead of shipping features. They'd moved fast initially, but they were moving slowly now because nobody had been thinking about sustainability. Here's how it manifests. A builder comes to you and says, I need to integrate with this new SaaS system. And builders are great at solving immediate problems. So they build an integration. It works. The business is happy. But the builder didn't think about, or wasn't asked to think about, what happens when that SaaS system's API changes? What happens when the password for the service account needs to be rotated? What happens when you need to audit who accessed what through that integration? What happens when 3 other builders independently build integrations to the same system? And now you have 3 different approaches, 3 different failure modes, 3 times the maintenance burden. The systemic cause is organizational structure. Builders create visible value. They ship, they deliver. Organizations see progress. Architects prevent invisible failures. They say no. They require documentation. They ask hard questions about sustainability. And their value is invisible until something breaks. By which time the organization has learned the hard way that architecture matters. The real consequence is fragmented ownership. Only 23% of organizations have a formal AI agent identity strategy. Think about that. AI agents are proliferating. Most organizations don't have governance for them. Why? Because ownership is fragmented. Security thinks it's IT's problem. It thinks it's the business's problem. The business thinks it's security's problem. And builders are shipping agents without anyone owning the architectural decision of whether they should exist or what their boundaries are. The economic consequence is substantial and usually lagged. You don't see it for 18 months. But when you do, it's expensive. Technical debt compounds, support costs rise, security risks accumulate, compliance becomes harder. And the organization realizes it needs architects, but architects are expensive to retrofit. You can't just hire one and expect them to untangle 18 months of architectural decisions made without their input. The control plane fix requires a mindset shift. Reframe architects as leverage engineers, not cost centers. A builder can increase velocity on one project. An architect can increase velocity across the entire system by making good structural decisions that everyone benefits from. An architect can prevent the entire organization from making the same mistake in 5 different places. Measure architects by system health, by entropy reduction, by the number of future problems they prevent, by whether integration patterns are consistent, by whether governance is enforceable, by whether new builders inherit a platform that's easy to build on or a swamp they have to wade through. Builders create visible value. Architects create invisible value. Invisible value is just as real. It's just harder to see. And organizations that don't see it are the ones that end up with sprawl, with chaos, with technical debt that becomes impossible to manage. And this brings us to the final sin, because even good architects fail if the foundational decisions about resources and investment are wrong. And that decision is usually made in procurement. Scene 7. Licensing blindness, capacity as strategy. The final sin is the most expensive because it's the most normalized. Organizations renew E5 because it's what we do. Not because they've mapped capability to value, not because they've assessed whether users actually need premium features, not because they've measured adoption of the premium connectors they're already paying for. They renew because the license was good last year, so it's good this year, and the year after that, no one questions it. Meanwhile, Shadow IT thrives. Users on basic SKUs accomplish the same roles as E5 users. Premium features sit idle. Copilot remains unused. The advanced threat protection that comes with E5 never gets operationalized. Feature parity is ignored. Nobody's tracking whether the premium capabilities you paid for are actually driving outcomes. Here's a real example. An enterprise paying $2.1 million annually for E5 across their knowledge worker base. They'd standardized on it years ago. E5 for finance, E5 for engineering, E5 for operations. Everyone gets the same license. An audit revealed the truth. 34% of those users, roughly a third, could perform their exact same role on business standard. They had no need for the premium connector library. They didn't use Copilot. They didn't need advanced threat protection beyond what business standard includes. They needed email, Teams, a document platform. That's it. They were paying for capabilities they would never touch. The economic consequence is orthogonal to what most organizations see. It's not just the cost of unused licenses. That's obvious. The real consequence is the cost of not using licensing as a behavioral incentive. If your licensing SKU is aligned to roles and capabilities, then it drives adoption. It forces architectural decisions. It makes you think about what people actually need. When you standardize on E5 across the board, you've removed the constraint that forces architectural discipline. You've said effectively that everyone gets access to everything. That's not strategy, that's capitulation. It's budget capitulation, it's architectural capitulation, and it's expensive. The 2026 price hikes compound this mistake. Microsoft is implementing increases ranging from 9 to 33% effective July 1st. F1 plans jumping from $2.25 to $3, E3 rising from $36 to $39 per user per month. That organization paying $2.1 million? Next renewal, that's closer to $2.4 million. If they'd rationalized licensing earlier, they could have cut that by 20-30%, but they didn't. And now they're paying twice for the same mistake. Here's what happens when you finally audit your licensing landscape. You discover premium connectors nobody's using. You find Copilot licenses assigned to roles that have no integration points. You realize that your premium security features are redundant with network-based controls you already paid for elsewhere. You uncover the fact that 34% of your E5 investment could be recovered if you had the discipline to match licensing to actual capability requirements. The control plane fix is this. Licensing SKU is a behavioral lever. Use it. If you're paying for E5 across the board, you've removed the mechanism that forces you to make architectural decisions. You've optimized for everyone gets everything instead of everyone gets what they need. Real architecture means saying no to simplicity. It means matching licensing to roles. E5 for roles that actually need premium connectors, threat intelligence, or advanced governance. E3 for users who need collaboration and productivity but not advanced security. Business standard for roles that only need core email and Teams functionality. And making those decisions forces you to understand your user base. It forces you to ask, why does this person need this capability? And if you can't answer that question, they don't get that license. This is where the abstraction becomes concrete, because when you force licensing alignment, you also force governance. You have to know who's in what role. You have to enforce role definitions. You have to make sure the business is actually using the features you're paying for. And that discipline cascades into everything else. Better identity governance, better data classification, better understanding of what your system is actually supposed to do. All 7 sins point to one diagnosis: the absence of a control plane. The umbrella sin, control plane neglect. These 7 sins don't exist in isolation. They're not random failures. They're not separate problems that happen to accumulate in the same tenant. They're all symptoms of one structural absence. And that absence is what binds them together into a single architectural failure. Operating without a systems layer means Entropy becomes your default operating system. You don't have governance. You have chaos with policies written on top of it, trying to contain something that was never architecturally constrained in the first place. You don't have architecture. You have a platform. And a platform is something else entirely. A platform is a collection of services. An architecture is a system. Here's how it manifests in practice. A 10,000-seat organization I worked with had Entra ID governed by one team. They handled identity provisioning, conditional access, role definitions. Solid work. Intune was managed by a separate team. They owned device management, endpoint security, compliance baselines. Also good. Microsoft Defender handled by another team. They owned threat detection, incident response, security monitoring. Yet another team owned purview, data governance, sensitivity labels, retention policies. And teams in SharePoint were loosely monitored by the service adoption team. They tracked usage metrics and provided training. Nobody was looking at identity to app orchestration. Nobody was enforcing zoning and tiering across the entire system. Every service had its own policies, its own approval workflows, its own definitions of what security baseline meant. Each domain solved its own problems locally. But there was no layer that decided how those domains actually interacted, how data flowed from one system to another, how a user's access decisions in Entra ID connected to what they could do in SharePoint, how that related to what they could see in a Copilot agent. What that organization actually had wasn't a security posture. It was security theater orchestrated across 5 different teams, each performing their part with no conductor. The systemic cause is this. Most organizations treat Microsoft Cloud as a collection of disconnected services. Identity over here, data governance over there, applications somewhere else, compliance in a separate silo. This creates what I call policy fragmentation. Each domain solves its own problems locally. But there's no layer that ensures consistency. No place that says, when we make an identity decision, what does that mean for data access, for app permissions, for compliance boundaries? That connecting layer is the control plane. And most organizations don't have one. They think they do. They point to their Entra ID governance. They show you their Defender dashboards. They talk about their purview compliance framework. But those are individual services responding to local constraints, not a unified system making coordinated decisions. The economic consequence of operating without it is massive. That 10,000-seat organization, 3.2 million in unrealized productivity benefits over 3 years. Not because they lacked features. They had every Microsoft feature available. But because those features weren't integrated into a system. Users couldn't find information because it was classified inconsistently across SharePoint. Admins couldn't trust their governance because policies drifted when one team made changes without checking impact on other teams. Architects had no way to enforce decisions at scale because there was no mechanism to translate intent into system-wide behavior. Control plane absence also means security debt accumulates invisibly. When Entra ID policies drift, nobody knows it. When SharePoint permissions exceed your threshold, there's nobody watching. When a Copilot agent is accessing data you never approved, the policy layer doesn't catch it. Each service does its best. But there's no circuit breaker, no orchestration, no central place where someone says, no, that violates our architecture. Real security data backs this up. 63% of M365 tenants face configuration tampering in identity and device management. And here's the architectural gap. Microsoft doesn't natively back up tenant configurations. You deploy Defender policies, you configure Entra ID, you set up purview rules. If something goes catastrophically wrong, if an attacker modifies your policies, if someone accidentally deletes your conditional access rules, you don't have a native recovery mechanism. You're relying on change logs and manual reconstruction. The control plane fix requires foundational architecture. You have to build a unified policy compilation layer, a single source of truth where architectural intent gets translated into system-wide policy. Treat identity, Entra ID, as the control plane backbone. Make it the place where you define not just who can access what, but what that access means across your entire system. A user is an employee, a contractor, a vendor, a guest. Once you make that decision in identity, every other system should inherit that context, not ask for it separately. Inherit it. Then enforce cross-platform orchestration. If a user's Entra ID role says finance, that determines their default access to financial data in SharePoint. If they are classified as guest, that determines what they see in Teams. If a Copilot agent is accessing customer data, its identity and permissions flow from a single source of truth. Let me define this precisely. A control plane is the system that makes decisions about how other systems behave. It's the layer above execution. It's where intent gets translated into policy. Without it, you have a platform, individual services operating independently. With it, you have architecture, you have a system. Most organizations have the first, almost none have the second. The leakage model. How to calculate your invisible waste. Let me walk you through a calculation, and I want you to follow along. If you have a notebook nearby, now's the time to grab it. This isn't complicated math, but it's the math most organizations never actually do, so they never see how much money is actually flowing out of their tenant invisibly. Start with your total seat count. Let's say you're a mid-sized organization. 5,000 employees, round number, easy to think about. Now, assume that roughly 20 to 30% of the advanced Microsoft capabilities you've paid for are not operationalized, not used, just available. This isn't cynicism, this is empirical. I've audited dozens of tenants. It's consistent. 1 in 3 advanced features sits idle. For a 5,000-seat organization on E5, the delta between E5 and E3 is roughly $12 per user per month. $12 times 5,000 seats times 12 months, that's $720,000 annually that you're spending on features you're not using. But that's just the beginning. Now add the inactive license premium. Roughly 10 to 15% of licenses are assigned to accounts that haven't logged in 30 days or longer. Dormant, forgotten, still being billed. If you're paying $36 per user for E5 and 15% of your licenses are inactive, that's another $250,000. Gone. Just evaporated. That's nearly $1 million right there. Now add Copilot. The base cost of Copilot is $30 per user per month. But that's not the real cost. That's the headline number. The real cost includes Copilot Studio credits burning through, $200 per 25,000 messages. For a tenant of 5,000 employees, if even half of them use Copilot occasionally, you're burning through credits fast. Call it $150,000 annually for a mid-sized deployment. Then add the security retrofits. When you deploy Copilot without data boundaries, you have to go back and classify data, define agent access, implement DLP policies. That's not a feature, that's remediation. Call it $50,000 in unplanned spending. So Copilot alone is consuming $200,000 plus, and that's conservative. And then there's governance labor. The hours spent managing Sprawl, the manual cleanup, the spreadsheets, the escalation emails. For a 5,000-seat tenant, that's roughly 2 full-time employees worth of effort. $150,000 annually, minimum, added up, $720,000 in unused feature capacity, $250,000 in inactive licenses, $200,000 in Copilot costs and security retrofits, $150,000 in governance labor. That's $1.3 million annually in a mid-sized organization. And here's what the breakdown actually looks like. License waste, features you paid for but don't use, accounts for about 40%. Unoptimized connectors and shadow IT, another 20%. AI sprawl, 15%. Governance labor that doesn't actually prevent anything, 25%. Real organizations implementing software asset management best practices can cut spending by 30% in year 1. 30% of 1.3 million is nearly $400,000. Recovered, just by paying attention. That's the leakage model. That's what most organizations are bleeding without knowing it. And that's before the July 2026 price increases hit. When they do, that leak gets worse, not better. But these numbers are symptoms. The disease is systemic. Root cause analysis, why this happens. The leakage isn't random. The 7 sins aren't coincidences. They're not separate failures that happen to occur in the same organization. They're structural outcomes of how enterprises make decisions about Microsoft Cloud. And if you understand the structure, you understand why this keeps happening. The core problem is an operating model failure, not a technical one. an organizational one. Architectural decisions about Microsoft 365 are made by procurement, not by architects. Let me say that again because it matters. The decision about what you're going to buy, which SKU, how many licenses, what feature set, that decision gets made at the procurement level. It gets made by someone looking at a spreadsheet comparing price per user across different vendors. It gets made by someone asking, what's the industry standard? And then buying that. It gets made by someone who's never been inside an Entra ID policy or a conditional access rule. And then that procurement decision gets treated as an architectural decision. We bought E5, so E5 is our architecture. We standardized on Teams, so Teams governance is solved. We licensed Copilot, so we have an AI strategy. That's not how architecture works. That's how you end up with a shopping cart instead of a system. The second structural problem is an accountability vacuum. Nobody owns the economic outcome. Budgets get siloed. Finance owns the Microsoft licensing budget. IT owns the infrastructure operations budget. The business owns their departmental software spending. Procurement owns vendor contracts. And nobody's looking at the tenant as a whole. Nobody's asking, are we getting value from this? Is the money we spent on E5 actually driving business outcomes? If the Copilot pilot stalls, who's accountable? Not the executive who approved the spending, not the business unit who didn't adopt it. It gets blamed on poor change management or lack of training. Nobody says we spent $200,000 on this and got nothing. Who owns that failure? This leads to the third problem. Finance is completely absent from architecture decisions. The CFO sees the spend line. The CIO sees the features. They never reconcile. The CFO doesn't know what the premium connectors cost. The CIO doesn't know how many of them are actually used. They're operating in different universes with different success metrics. The CFO wants to reduce cost. The CIO wants to increase adoption. Those aren't aligned. They're at odds. And when they're at odds, neither gets what they want. You end up with expensive features that nobody uses and cheap tools that everybody re-implements with shadow IT. This is what I call the procurement-led transformation trap. The organization buys the right tools. The tools are technically sound. Microsoft 365 is a good platform. But then procurement declares victory. We bought the right tools. We have the right strategy. Success is now inevitable, except it's not. 85% of organizations increased AI investments in the past 12 months. Only 5% are what Gartner calls future-built leaders. Organizations that are actually getting multiplier effects from their AI spending. The other 80% bought the tools. They didn't build the architecture. Here's a real story. An enterprise spent $4.2 million on Microsoft 365 modernization. That's not a small bet. That's organizational commitment. And they measured success by adoption percentage. Did people use Teams? Yes. Did they log into SharePoint? Yes. Did usage go up? Absolutely. But did those tools drive business outcomes? Nobody measured that. Did the premium capabilities actually reduce support tickets? Nobody tracked it. Did automation save labor hours? Nobody quantified it. The only metric was adoption. And adoption looked good. But adoption isn't architecture. Adoption is visibility. Someone using a tool doesn't mean the tool is solving a problem. It just means they're using it. And here's the final structural problem. This is the one most organizations don't want to hear. Microsoft doesn't enforce governance. It enables chaos by default. Every service in Microsoft 365 assumes you want to be permissive. Everyone can create teams. Everyone can register apps. Everyone can consent to permissions. Everyone can share data widely. That's not a bug. That's a feature. It makes the product more accessible. But that permissiveness cascades into sprawl without intentional architecture to constrain it. Microsoft doesn't force you to classify data. It doesn't require approval for Copilot agents. It doesn't mandate permission lifecycles. Those are architectural decisions you have to make. And most organizations don't make them. So they get the default behavior, which is chaos. This is not Microsoft's failure. It's yours, and it's fixable. But fixing it requires a different operating model. The compliance wall, CMMC 2.0, and the architect's trap. Here's what happens when you don't architect for tomorrow's requirements. Tomorrow's requirements architect you instead. CMMC 2.0 enforcement became mandatory on November 10th, 2025. That date has already passed, and it caught a lot of organizations flat-footed. CMMC is the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. It's the Department of Defense's way of saying that if you want to work with us, if you want a government contract, if you want to touch controlled unclassified information, which is what the DoD calls CUI, then your security infrastructure has to meet specific standards, not guidelines, standards. 110 controls from NIST SP 871. Level 2 compliance is non-negotiable. And here's the architectural detail that matters. Microsoft 365 commercial cannot be used for CMMC Level 2, full stop. The commercial cloud is multi-tenant. Data from your organization sits alongside data from other organizations. The DoD doesn't accept that risk boundary. So if you're a defense contractor and you've been using Microsoft 365 commercial, which is what most organizations do because it's cheaper and simpler, you cannot use it for CUI anymore. You have to migrate to GCC High. Government Community Cloud, a separate, isolated cloud environment, different infrastructure, different data centers, different governance. It's not a checkbox upgrade. It's a retenanting. It's an architectural pivot. How it manifests in practice. A defense contractor, 2,000 seats, running in commercial. They're already using Teams, Exchange, SharePoint. Everything's deployed, integrated, working. Then CMMC enforcement happens. And suddenly they learn usually from their compliance officer or their government customer, that they need to be in GCC High by a specific date or they lose their contract. Now they're scrambling. They have to migrate 2,000 users and all their data to a completely different cloud environment. They have to revalidate their conditional access policies because GCC High has different feature availability. They have to retest integrations because third-party connectors behave differently in government clouds. They have to re-architect their governance because the audit logging in GCC High works differently than in commercial. The systemic cause is straightforward. Compliance requirements were not baked into the initial tenant design. The organization chose commercial because it was the standard choice. Nobody asked, if we're a defense contractor, what are our long-term compliance requirements? Nobody mapped that requirement to an architectural decision. Nobody said, we should build this in GCC High from day one, even though it's more expensive because our business model requires it. Instead, the organization built for cost and simplicity. And then when compliance requirements arrived, they had to re-tenant, which is expensive. Real numbers: a defense contractor re-tenanting 2,000 users to GCC High. Professional services alone, the migration effort, the testing, the validation, runs north of $500,000. Then there's the period of operational disruption. Users relearning systems that work slightly differently, integrations that broke and had to be rebuilt, training for the new environment, audits that have to be repeated, and the extended timeline. What should have been a 2-week migration stretched to 3 months because the architecture wasn't built for it. The economic consequence is layered: the direct cost of migration, the opportunity cost of the engineering team's time diverted to crisis mode, the risk of incomplete migration where some data or configurations get missed, discovered later in an audit, and the ongoing cost. GCC High licensing is more expensive than commercial, and you can't easily move back. The control plane fix is ruthlessly simple. Design your tenant for your compliance requirements from day one, not eventually. Day one. If you're a defense contractor, you build in GCC High. You accept the higher cost and complexity upfront because your business model requires it. If you're in healthcare, you might need HIPAA compliance, which affects data residency and audit logging. If you're in financial services, you might need SOC 2, which affects who can access what. These aren't nice to haves. These are architectural constraints. And here's the lesson that applies beyond CMMC. The window for architectural decisions closes early. You make the decision about which cloud to use, about how to classify data, about where to store information, and then that decision constrains everything that comes after. If you make the wrong decision early because you didn't anticipate compliance requirements, you're rebuilding later. That's expensive. If you don't architect for tomorrow's requirements will architect you. And by then you're already operating at a cost disadvantage. The recovery path from decay to design. Here's the thing about architecture. You can't fix it all at once. You have to fix it deliberately in phases with clear outcomes at each step. Otherwise, you'll just be throwing money at problems without solving the structural issues that created them. Recovery from tenant decay follows a pattern. And the pattern works. I've seen it work dozens of times. It takes 90 days to get to a place where you can actually claim you have architecture instead of just a platform running unsupervised. Phase 1 is 30 days. Audit and inventory. You have to see what you've actually got before you can change anything. This means discovering inactive licenses, running reports on user login history, finding accounts that haven't authenticated in 30 days or longer. These are your easy wins. You reclaim them immediately. You also discover orphaned apps, the 340 power apps, the 847 app registrations, the automation flows that nobody remembers creating. You don't delete them yet, you just inventory them. Who owns this? Has it been used? Is there a business case for keeping it? You also do a permission audit. You look at Entra ID roles. You find the accounts with excessive privilege. You find the service principals with credentials that haven't been rotated. You find application permissions that exceed what the application actually needs. None of this gets fixed in phase 1. You just establish what the baseline looks like. By the end of 30 days, you have clarity. You know how much leakage exists. You know how many licenses are wasted. You know how many orphaned applications are sitting in your environment. You have a number, and that number becomes your benchmark for recovery. Phase 2 is 60 days. Automate governance. Now that you know what you have, you start building the systems that will prevent decay from happening again. You deploy lifecycle workflows in Entra ID. When a user joins, their access gets provisioned automatically. When they leave, their access gets deprovisioned automatically. No manual process, no spreadsheets, no emails asking someone to remember to offboard this person. The system does it. You implement entitlement management. You create access packages that bundle related permissions. Employee joins the finance team, they automatically get access to the finance shared mailbox, the finance SharePoint site, the finance team's channel, all through a single approval workflow. Not separate requests to different people. Not finding out 3 weeks later that someone didn't get access to something they needed. You enforce sensitivity labels and data loss prevention at scale. Every document in SharePoint gets classified, not manually, automatically, based on content analysis, based on metadata. If a document contains sensitive financial information, it gets the finance label automatically. And once it's labeled, DLP policies automatically restrict how it can be shared. You can't email a sensitive financial document externally. The policy blocks it. Phase 3 is 90 days. Build the control plane. This is where you architect. You define a policy compilation layer, a single system of truth where organizational intent gets translated into platform policy. You establish Entra ID as the orchestration backbone. Every other system in your tenant inherits authorization decisions from identity. A user's role in Entra ID determines their access to data in SharePoint, their visibility in Teams, their permissions in Copilot agents. You implement cross-platform governance. When you make a decision in one place, it cascades everywhere. It doesn't break systems. It doesn't create exceptions. It creates consistency. A global firm I worked with followed this path. 5,000 seats. They recovered $1.2 million in year one through systematic rationalization. They reclaimed $130,000 in unused licenses in month one. They decommissioned 78 orphaned Power Apps in month 2. By month 3, they'd reduced their password reset volume by 86% through automated entitlement management. The research is consistent. The break-even point for technology investment in M365 is 54 minutes of time savings per employee per month. This organization achieved that in the first 30 days. Everything after that was pure recovery. Measurable outcomes matter. Onboarding time dropped 25%. Help desk tickets for access requests basically disappeared. Compliance audits became routine instead of crisis. They could prove they had governance because governance was built into the platform. But recovery requires something else beyond process. The mindset shift. From procurement to architecture, recovery requires a mindset shift. And mindset shifts are harder than process changes because they require executives to change how they think about what they're doing. The shift sounds simple when you say it, but it reshapes everything. Stop asking, what tools should we buy? Start asking, what system do we need? This is the fundamental reframe. Most organizations approach Microsoft 365 like they're shopping. What features do we need? What's the industry standard? What are competitors using? What's the price per user? And then they buy. They've solved the problem by acquiring the product. But tools and systems are different things. A tool is something you buy and deploy. A system is something you architect. A tool solves isolated problems. A system solves interconnected problems. You can buy Copilot. That's a tool, but you can't buy a Copilot system. You have to architect it. You have to decide what data it accesses. You have to define its boundaries. You have to think about how it integrates with governance. You have to measure what it actually delivers. The shift from tools to systems changes everything because now the question isn't, how do we buy this faster? It's, what are we trying to accomplish? And how does this tool fit into the larger system we need? Stop measuring by adoption percentage. Start measuring by economic realization. Most organizations track adoption because it's visible. How many users logged into Copilot? How many Teams channels got created? How many people attended training? These metrics feel like success because they're easy to see. And they're useless. A user logged into Copilot once and never returned. Is that adoption? Technically, yes. But economically, it's a failure. You spend $30 a month on a license that delivered zero value. That's not adoption. That's waste measured in percentages. Real metrics are different. Did Copilot reduce the time it takes to write a report? By how much? Can you quantify that? Did it reduce password reset calls? How many fewer calls per month? Did it accelerate onboarding? By how long? These are economic metrics. They connect tool usage to business outcome, and they're much harder to achieve, so organizations don't measure them. They measure adoption instead. Stop treating architects as cost centers. Start treating them as leverage multipliers. This is the hardest mindset shift because it requires the organization to value something that's invisible until something breaks. A builder creates a feature, everyone sees it, the business sees value immediately. An architect prevents a problem that would have cost millions to fix later. Nobody sees it because the problem never happened. That invisibility is dangerous. It gets architects fired and builders promoted. But here's the arithmetic. One architect can set standards that affect hundreds of builders. One architectural decision about how to handle data boundaries can prevent thousands of hours of rework later. One governance framework that automates entitlement management can reclaim hundreds of thousands of dollars in license waste and labor. That's leverage. Stop treating licensing as a budget line item. Start treating it as a behavioral incentive. Licensing SKU drives behavior. If you assign everyone E5, you're saying everyone gets access to everything. That removes all constraint. It removes all discipline. It removes the mechanism that forces you to make hard architectural decisions about what people actually need. But if you intentionally align licensing to roles, then the organization has to know what roles are. It has to enforce role definitions. It has to ask, why does this person need this capability? And in asking that question, it starts building architecture instead of buying features. A CIO I worked with made this shift explicitly. They'd been trying to drive Copilot adoption, rolling it out to everyone, measuring usage metrics. Adoption wasn't happening. Usage was low. Value was unclear. So they reframed it. Instead of Copilot as a productivity tool, they said Copilot is a data governance accelerator. And they changed who got licenses. Not everyone. Teams that had high data governance maturity, teams that had classified their data, teams that understood their compliance requirements. Suddenly, Copilot became an incentive for doing the unglamorous work of data classification first. This is what reframing looks like in practice. Not different tools, different intent, different alignment, different outcomes. And here's the final reframe. Your Microsoft Tenant is not a collection of applications. It is not a set of services you subscribe to. It is an economic system. Every decision has an economic consequence. Every sprawl you tolerate costs money. Every governance gap you ignore compounds into debt. The question isn't, do we have Microsoft 365? The question is, are we managing it as a system? The governance operating model, how to sustain it. Recovery is the easy part. Sustaining it is where most organizations fail. You'll go through the 90-day recovery. You'll reclaim licenses. You'll decommission orphaned applications. You'll implement automation. And for about 6 months, the organization will feel good about it. We fixed it. We're more efficient. We have governance. Then slowly, Entropy returns. A new business unit wants to deploy a Copilot agent without following the approval workflow. Someone creates a Teams channel for a project and assigns permissions too broadly. A new integration gets built because the standard integration points are documented poorly and the builder doesn't know they exist. The control plane drifts. Policies become suggestions again. This is why governance requires an operating model. Not a one-time intervention, not a checklist you complete and then ignore. An ongoing system that sustains architectural discipline. Governance operating models have 3 components: ownership, decision rights, cadence. First, ownership. Somebody has to own the control plane. Not everyone. Not a committee that meets quarterly, one accountable person or a small office that owns architectural intent and policy consistency. At many organizations, this gets assigned to the CIO, but if your CIO is spread across 100 initiatives, ownership becomes meaningless. Effective models establish a distinct role: chief architect or office of architecture or governance council lead, someone whose primary responsibility, not secondary, not among other things, is ensuring the control plane stays intact. This ownership is active, it's not theoretical, it's weekly staff meetings where the architecture team reviews what's being requested. New applications, new integrations, new data classifications, new governance exceptions. Every request flows through this office. And the office has the authority to say no, not to obstruct, to enforce standards. Second, decision rights. Define explicitly who decides what. This prevents the diffusion of responsibility that kills governance. Who approves new applications? Not the business. Specifically, the Application Review Board. Who has authority to create Copilot agents? The AI Governance Council. Who decides data classifications? The data owner with IT validation. Who can request exceptions to conditional access policies? The executive sponsor with the CISO's sign-off. Write these down, make them clear, and then enforce them without exception. Real exceptions happen, legitimate ones. But if you grant exceptions without requiring explicit approval and documented business justification, exceptions become the rule, and rules become irrelevant. Third, cadence. Governance that operates only in crisis mode isn't governance, it's damage control. Establish 3 levels of rhythm. Weekly operational. This is the governance team meeting to review requests, approve standard decisions, identify anomalies. Not long meetings, 30 minutes. What came in this week? Are we seeing drift? Do we need to escalate anything? Monthly tactical. This is the broader review. How are policies performing? What did automation catch? What required manual intervention? Are there patterns we should address? Are there new threats we need to govern against? Quarterly strategic. This is alignment with business outcomes. Are our governance decisions supporting business goals? Are we over-controlling and blocking innovation? Are we under-controlling and exposing risk? Do we need to adjust policies based on what we've learned? This is the meeting that connects governance to business impact. Tie this to outcomes. Organizations with formal governance operating models achieve 130% or higher ROI in year 1, not through cost savings alone, through the compounding effect of consistent decision-making, of reduced rework, of architects preventing problems instead of engineers fixing them after the fact. A global enterprise established an architecture council. Representatives from IT, finance, security, business met quarterly, reviewed all new initiatives, evaluated them against architectural standards, caught problems early. Within 2 years, they'd reduced infrastructure change failures by 70% because architectural intent was clear and decisions were coordinated. Track metrics that matter, not adoption, cost per seat, feature utilization percentage, audit readiness score, breach risk score. These connect governance to business reality. Is your Copilot adoption tracking? Measure actual time saved, not just login events. Are your license costs predictable? Track cost per user by role. Is your security posture hardening? Measure your conditional access coverage, your MFA adoption rate, your unmanaged device exposure. These metrics create accountability. The governance team owns them. They report quarterly. When metrics drift, someone has to explain why and what they're doing to fix it. This is not optional. This is foundational. Without an operating model to sustain it, your recovery becomes temporary. Within 18 months, you're back where you started. Slightly more expensive, but fundamentally unchanged. With it, governance becomes a permanent capability, something the organization does, not something it periodically attempts. The executive prescription, what leadership must do. Here's what needs to happen. Not eventually. Before your next renewal. Before the July 2026 price increases, force your hand. Demand an architecture audit before your next license renewal. Not a vendor assessment, not a feature comparison. An actual audit. Someone independent, not your infrastructure team, they have incentive to minimize problems. Comes in and maps your tenant. What's actually running? What's being used? What's decaying? What's the compliance posture? What's the governance maturity? Cost is secondary, truth is primary. This audit produces 3 artifacts. First, a baseline of where you are. What's the current leakage? How much license waste exists? What's your security debt? Second, a gap analysis. If you want to achieve a specific level of governance maturity, what do you need to change? Third, a recovery roadmap, 90 days, minimum, clear milestones, economic outcomes measured. This audit is not free. Plan for $50,000 to $150,000 depending on size. That's not an expense, that's insurance, because proceeding to renewal without this audit means you're renewing based on assumptions. And your assumptions are wrong. Everyone's assumptions are wrong. Require quarterly economic outcome reporting tied to your Microsoft spend. Your CFO shouldn't see a line item that says Microsoft 365, $3.2 million. Your CFO should see Microsoft 365, $3.2 million. ROI outcomes, reduced time to onboard by 25%, automated 86% of access requests, prevented 4 compliance failures. That's a conversation. That's governance. Establish a control plane governance model with clear ownership. Assign someone, explicitly, not a committee, not a part-time responsibility, someone whose primary job is ensuring architectural intent gets enforced. Give them authority to approve or reject requests. Give them budget, measure them by system health, not by features shipped. Map licensing SKU to organizational roles and capabilities. This is unglamorous work, but it's mandatory. You need a matrix. Finance roles require E5 because they need advanced threat intelligence and premium connectors. Engineering roles require E3 because they need collaboration but not premium security. Support roles require business standard because they need email and Teams and nothing else. Write this down, make it policy, enforce it. Implement automated compliance monitoring for regulatory requirements. If you're a defense contractor, you need to know continuously whether you're maintaining CMMC compliance. Not at audit time, continuously. If you're in healthcare, you need to know whether your HIPAA controls are intact, automated real-time. This requires tooling, it requires investment, it's non-negotiable. Real story. A CFO at a mid-market organization demanded an ROI model before approving the Copilot rollout. The team pushed back. Just let us pilot it. See how adoption goes. The CFO said no. Show me the model. Show me what time savings we'll achieve. Show me how that translates to economic value. They built the model and they discovered something. 40% of existing E5 licenses could be downgraded to E3 because users weren't using the premium connectors or the advanced security features. They were just using the basic collaboration tools. 40%, that's hundreds of thousands of dollars recovered before they spent a dime on Copilot. The CFO's insistence on economic modeling exposed the real problem. Here's the conversation starter. If you cannot explain your Microsoft strategy in economic terms, you don't have a strategy. You have a shopping list. A strategy connects technical decisions to business outcomes. A strategy says, we're implementing this control because it reduces risk. Or we're decommissioning that because it's not driving value. Or we're investing in governance because the savings from automation exceed the cost by 5 to 1. If you can't say those things, you don't have a strategy. And here's the non-negotiable. Procurement is not transformation, architecture is. Stop conflating the two. Buying tools is easy. Building systems is hard. One is a transaction, the other is a capability. One generates a purchase order, the other generates economic value. Your job as a leader is to demand architecture, not procurement. Demand that before you renew, someone explains to you how your Microsoft tenant is actually organized, what the control plane looks like, how decisions are enforced, what's working, what's decaying, what the economics actually are. That's leadership. Everything else is just spending money. The uncomfortable truth, why this matters now. This is not a 2027 problem. This is a 2026 problem, and it's already here. Microsoft is increasing prices 9 to 33% effective July 1st, 2026. That date is approaching. For most organizations, that's your next renewal window. The question isn't whether prices are going up. The question is whether you'll be paying higher prices on a rationalized tenant or a decayed one. If you rationalize now, before renewal, you recover license waste while you're still paying current pricing. A 30% cost reduction on your E5 mix, locked in at today's rates, survives the July increase. If you wait until after the increase, you're recovering 30% of a higher base. You're optimizing at a disadvantage. The arithmetic is stark. A global firm delayed rationalization. They told themselves they'd address it after their renewal. Their renewal landed 2 weeks after the price increase. They tried to right-size licenses then. They recovered 100,000 in quarterly waste, but they were recovering it from a base that had already increased by 300,000. They optimized too late. They're now paying 200,000 more annually than if they had acted before the increase. The second pressure is regulatory. The compliance landscape is tightening, not loosening. CMMC 2.0 enforcement is not optional. It's not something to handle eventually. It's here. And if you're a defense contractor and you're not already in GCC high, you're operating on borrowed time. Your customer will enforce it. Your contract depends on it. Waiting until you lose the contract is expensive. Beyond CMMC, state-level AI regulation is accelerating. 38 US states enacted roughly 100 AI measures in 2025. The number is growing, and regulations require governance. Real governance, not policies written in English. Automated enforcement, audit trails, human oversight. These are not optional nice-to-haves. These are requirements, and they're expensive to retrofit. The third pressure is threat velocity. Tenant-level attacks are becoming more sophisticated. 63% of M365 tenants face configuration tampering. And here's the architectural consequence. Microsoft doesn't natively back up tenant configurations. You deploy a conditional access policy. An attacker modifies it. You have no recovery point, no native rollback. You're reconstructing from logs if you're lucky. If you're not, you're rebuilding. That's not a theoretical risk. That's your architecture exposing you to extended downtime with no recovery path. The fourth pressure is AI sprawl. And this one's moving faster than you can see it. 80% of Fortune 500 companies are using active AI agents. 80%, and most of them have no formal strategy for agent identity management. No governance, no boundaries. Agents are proliferating, consuming credits, accessing data, operating without oversight. Copilot itself burns tokens fast. The cost model isn't linear. Popular agents accelerate consumption. And without capacity planning, without governance, without boundaries, your Copilot budget becomes unpredictable. The tenant debt of unmanaged agents is real, and it's compounding faster than cleanup can address it. And here's what ties all four pressures together. The window for proactive architecture is closing. Every month you delay recovery, you're storing up compound problems. More orphaned applications accumulate, more permissions drift, more inactive licenses get billed, more technical debt accrues, and every month the cost of fixing it later increases. Organizations that act now, in the next 90 days, have leverage. You can recover licenses before the price increase. You can rationalize Copilot costs before agent sprawl becomes unmanageable. You can implement governance frameworks before regulatory audits expose gaps. You can build a control plane while you still have the organizational bandwidth to do it. Organizations that wait face a different arithmetic. They'll pay higher prices on misaligned licenses. They'll face compliance fines because governance wasn't in place. They'll have security incidents from unmanaged agents and permission sprawl. And they'll pay crisis premiums to fix all of it at once. This is not doom. This is inevitability. This is what happens when debt compounds. The question isn't whether it will happen. It's whether you'll address it proactively or reactively. The final diagnosis. Here's what I know. Your Microsoft tenant is leaking millions. You're financing your own decay. And you can stop it. The problem is not Microsoft. It is the absence of economic ownership in your architecture. The solution is not more tools. It is a control plane. The timeline is not eventually. It is now. Remember this. This is not about tools. This is about economic ownership. Audit your tenant. Establish governance ownership. Measure economic outcomes. Do it in the next 90 days. Your margins depend on it.